Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Quoc Nam Tran. I am a professor of computer science and the president of the Faculty Senate. I would like to welcome all of you to our 26th Distinguished Faculty Lecture tonight. And the first thing I would like to mention is that come with us today, we have Dr. Steve Doblin, the Provost and Vice President for Academic Affairs, and his wife, Susie Doblin. And we have also Dr. Greg Lassen, the Vice President for Finance and Operation, and his wife, Jackie Lassen. Every year, the Faculty Senate lists the process for selecting the Distinguished Faculty Lecturer of the Year, and this year the committee selected Dr. Jim Esser, the Professor of Psychology, as this year's Distinguished Faculty Lecturer. And he will be formally introduced later by Paul Esser. But I would like to take this opportunity to thank all members of the committee for selecting and for preparing for this lecture, not only the dinner, but also preparing for the lecture, preparing for the room, and many other preparation. The committee includes faculty senators, professors, university professors, instructors, and also staffs. And the committee is headed by Dr. Tommy Thompson. And I would like to invite all committee members to stand up for recognition. Thank you. This year, we select Dr. Jim Esser. One of the reasons for selecting Dr. Esser as this year, the 26th Distinguished Faculty Lecturer, is that his topic about negotiating with the terrorists, an updated topic. And I agree with the committee about that. In fact, since its first use in 1795, terrorism struck around the world, starting from the French Revolution to the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, and then to Saddam Hussein, and it comes to our homeland at 9/11, 2001, and recently the strike at our embassy in Benghazi in Libya. And it shows that terrorists are striking at any time, and at, I will let Dr. Esser mention about that. But the point here is that the faculty, the Distinguished Faculty Lecturer is not only an example about doing research, but also about how to share the ideas and how to share the innovation with the students and also with our faculty, with our colleagues. That's one of the reasons why Dr. Esser has been selected this year. And now I would like to introduce Dr. Doblin for giving some speech.
Thanks, Dr. Tran. Again, my name is Steve Doblin. I serve as Provost and Vice President for Academic Affairs here at Lamar. And on behalf of the Division of Academic Affairs, welcome to the 26th Annual Distinguished Faculty Lecturer. We're so glad that you could join us tonight for this recognition of excellence, and you get an interesting talk to boot. Over the years, the Distinguished Faculty Lecture Series has honored 25 different Lamar University scholars from a broad range of academic disciplines. And of course, the recipients are listed in your program. What's really special about the selection, of course, is that the distinguished faculty lecturer has been selected by a committee of his or her peers. The distinguished faculty lecturers are all outstanding researchers, and through the knowledge that they discover, create, and apply, they bring excitement and wonder to both the undergraduate classroom as well as the graduate classroom. If you will remain a few moments after the lectures has been concluded, we'll have a brief presentation. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Paul Esser, who's going to introduce his dad.
It is my honor and pleasure to introduce a wonderful man who really doesn't need an introduction. Most of you know him, actually. My father, Jim Esser. Some of you may ask, why or what's a nice guy from Iowa talking about negotiating with terrorists? But you know what? Some might say that he's got a lot of experience in it. My stepmother might say that he has experience with negotiation every day. But I'll say that he started his work on negotiations when he graduated with his PhD from Indiana in social psychology and conflict management. Since then, he's accumulated a lot of experience working with negotiations over the years, including a lot in the Golden Triangle area. But beyond businesses in the area, tonight you'll hear him talk about terrorism. And this is obviously one of the major fears in the world today. In his lecture, he'll talk about a number of different areas, including Northern Ireland, the PLO in Israel, and the Basque country of Spain. When he shows you pictures of the Peace Wall, those were taken on a trip that we actually had in 2006. On that trip, we'd actually done some sightseeing, and we stopped at a bar across from the Hotel Europa. And we sat there and said, that's a nice hotel. And being obvious tourists, the waiter stopped us and said, that is the most frequently bombed hotel in Europe. He said, okay. We finished our beers and we decided to go look at something else. And we actually got a cab. And so we were driving around town and he was pointing things out to us. And one of those things is actually the Peace Wall. And we, of course, just said, hey, what's that? It's a big wall. And he said, yeah, no, sure, that's the Peace Wall. And then we drove through a gate in it and we said, okay, so there's no worries about driving on either side of it. He said, no. We still have half an hour before they close it for the rest of the day. Oh, okay, fair enough. But that's just one example of experiences that he's had and that we've had in his research. I'll give you another one that maybe is more closely related to his research on this particular paper. He set up an interview over the summer to interview the Basque terrorist group, ETA. It turned out the guy that showed up for the interview was a Spanish senator. He's from the Basque country and a member of what was formerly Batasuna, the ETA outlawed political party now called Bildu. Now, you must understand that they don't just talk to anybody. And before that, they were allowed to have a conversation with him. They requested a copy of his work, and they wanted to make sure that they had an understanding of what he was all about. So after they read some of his recent, one of his most recent publications on negotiation, this senator asked my father what ideas he had for future negotiations. And they actually sat and discussed the state of the issue between the Basque separatists and the Spanish government for a number of hours. But I'll stop talking, but I will say that it's pretty obvious that he knows what he's talking about. And without further ado, it is my honor and pleasure to introduce to you the two-time winner of the Distinguished Faculty Lecturer Award from 1995 and now 2012, Dr. James Esser.
Well, let me say first, thank you, Paul. Paul was invited, of course, since he only lives in Houston, so he's not very far away, and we invited him to come listen to the talk. And then he arrived about, now I guess it's been about 3.5 hours ago, and when he arrived in town, he found out that first, my wife is sick today. She was going to be the person who was going to do the introduction. So he walked in the door and I said, "Paul, you're going to introduce me tonight." And he said, "Okay." And I certainly appreciate it. Otherwise, you wouldn't know who I am. So anyway, I want to echo what was said earlier about thanking all the folks who work on the Distinguished Faculty Lecture Committee. They put in a lot of hard work, and it's almost always in the background. And without them, of course, this event couldn't take place. So I'm real pleased to have such a good team. That said, as you can see, this lecture is about negotiating with terrorists. And so let's get started. Now, for most of us, terrorism hit home on 9/11/2001. We all know that on that day, al-Qaeda terrorists hijacked 4 commercial airliners, destroyed the Twin Towers, and severely damaged the Pentagon. And about 3,000 people were killed in the attacks. Now, the response by the United States is a pretty understandable one. It was a declaration of war. We know it now as the global war on terrorism. And the idea was very simple. We were going to find out who was responsible, and then we were going to kill him. But what is terrorism? There's lots of definitions, but we can say that terrorism is the strategic use of fear to advance one's objectives. And usually that means terrorism is violence targeting civilians. Its purpose is to destroy the support for leaders or policies that the terrorists want to change. It also means that terrorist violence is a tool used by terrorists to achieve their goals. And this is important because most terrorists have other tools in their toolbox as well. Tools such as media campaigns, diplomacy, and in the right circumstances, even negotiation. Well, we'll see about that. It's often been said that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. And this statement highlights the fact that we apply the terrorism label to those whose politics we oppose, but not to those we favor. For example, during the Arab Spring, we in the United States did not consider the insurgents in Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, and now in Syria to be terrorists. However, insurgents such as Hamas or Hezbollah are considered terrorist organizations. But from their own perspective, all of these groups see themselves as the good guys. Now, sometimes the terrorist is a single individual. For example, Ted Kaczynski, also known as the Unabomber, carried out his private campaign of terrorism while living as a hermit in a cabin in Montana. But loners like Kaczynski are the exception. The most serious acts of terrorism are carried out by members of terrorist organizations. And in 2010, the U.S. State Department listed 55 foreign terrorist organizations. And this number is actually larger when other countries add their favorite terrorist groups to the list. Another question that comes up about terrorism and terrorists is, what about the leaders? What about the members and the leaders of terrorist organizations? What's the matter with them? Are they crazy? Psychological research says no. There's no psychological trait or psychopathology that distinguishes terrorists from the rest of us. And likewise, there's no evidence for some direct cause of terrorism, such as poverty or lack of education. Instead, we can view individuals who become terrorists as the end result of a 4-stage process which winnows down a very large pool. So, as I said, the pool of potential terrorists can be huge. These are people who see themselves and their group as unfairly treated. At the first stage, some of these people can see no way to eliminate the perceived injustice. They're vulnerable to influence, directing their frustrations and anger toward an enemy scapegoat. Then at the second stage, some of these angry people begin to see terrorist violence as justified. And at the third stage, some of these people who see terrorism as justified are recruited into the terrorist organization. And at this stage, conformity and obedience are required. Their thinking continues toward a rigid us versus them worldview. And then finally, at the fourth stage, some of these people are selected and trained for specific acts of terrorist violence. These few individuals view anyone outside their own secret terrorist cell, including civilians, as part of the enemy. Now, we've all heard that democracies must never give in to terrorism, and that terrorists must never be rewarded for using violence. And there are lots of good arguments against negotiating with terrorists. Let me give you just a few examples of these sorts of arguments. Negotiations, for example, give legitimacy to the terrorists. If we negotiate with them, we legitimize them. Another argument is that negotiations with terrorists undermine the good guys, that is, those who pursue political change by peaceful means. And a third argument, negotiations can give terrorists time to rearm themselves for their next act of terrorist violence. So it seems obvious. We should not negotiate with terrorists. But we do it all the time. I want to repeat that because it's so important. We do it all the time. Here's just a few examples, that I could pick up in just a short little time, looking through the newspapers and the internet news and that sort of thing. The Afghan government and moderate elements of the Taliban have been talking since 2003. And earlier this year, there were news reports that the United States and the Taliban were involved in preliminary talks. And just last year, Israel, with its reputation for toughness against terrorism, negotiated a prisoner exchange deal with Hamas. An Israeli soldier kidnapped by Hamas and held for more than 5 years was exchanged for approximately 1,000 Palestinians held in Israeli prisons. This photo shows the Israeli soldier right after his release. That's him here, that's his father, and that's Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu. So it does happen. And if it does happen, it makes sense to try to understand how negotiations with terrorist organizations actually work. So that gets us to the meat of this lecture. We start with a psychological theory of how the good guys, that is, leaders of democratic governments, and the bad guys, leaders of terrorist organizations, decide to start negotiating in the first place. Now, according to readiness theory, the readiness of each leader to negotiate depends on his motivation to end the conflict and his optimism about the success of the negotiation. A leader's motivation is higher when he believes that the conflict cannot be won militarily or that it's too costly or risky to continue. The leader's motivation can also be increased by pressure from his allies or from powerful third parties. A leader's optimism is increased when he perceives that the other side has a valid spokesperson. That is, he's more optimistic that negotiation can succeed if he thinks that the opposition has somebody who can actually deliver on what we have agreed upon during the negotiations. And secondly, optimism is increased if the leader perceives the negotiation will not require the sacrifice of his side's core objectives. Yes, negotiation involves a give and take. It involves some compromise. But if you think that you're going to have to give up everything well, what's the point in negotiating? It's not really negotiation after all. And full readiness for negotiation is higher when the situation is symmetrical. That is, when the leaders on both sides are motivated and they're optimistic. Now, I'm going to be talking about 3 examples of negotiations with terrorists tonight. The first example is the 1993 negotiation that took place between the government of Israel and the terrorist group, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or the PLO. This negotiation's come to be called the Oslo Talks. Now, in the years leading up to the Oslo Talks, the desire to end the conflict had been growing. The PLO, which was led by Chairman Yasser Arafat, had been supported both politically and financially by the Soviet Union, and also by most of the Middle Eastern countries, the Arab countries. This support, however, was reduced by the breakup of the Soviet Union, and then it was reduced again by the Arab countries when they basically retaliated for the PLO's support of Iraq during the first Gulf War. Now, on the other hand, Israel had recently had to contain a Palestinian uprising, or intifada. So maintaining control over both the West Bank and Gaza was a costly task, it was a thankless task. And in addition, the rise of militant Islamic Hamas as an organization in Palestine was an important motivator for both sides. Hamas was a fundamentalist Palestinian group, and it could potentially ally with Iran. And of course, together they would represent a serious military threat to Israel. On the other hand, Hamas was a threat to replace the PLO, so they were a threat to Yasser Arafat and the PLO as well. So both the leader of the PLO and the Israeli leadership had reason to be motivated to negotiate. In 1992, Yitzhak Rabin was elected prime minister of Israel, and his Labor Party platform had introduced the promise, had included the promise to negotiate some sort of autonomy for the Palestinians. And of course, this caused optimism for Arafat and the PLO. Israeli optimism was increased by its awareness of the PLO's weaknesses. So the actual Oslo talks were organized in a roundabout and secret way. Now, a member of the Israeli government could not talk directly to the PLO because the PLO was a terrorist organization. But it just so happened that a Norwegian sociologist by the name of Larsen was studying the living conditions of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. And this is Larsen. Here he is again. And Larsen's wife was a senior officer in the Norwegian Foreign Service, and that's her over here. So Israel's new deputy foreign minister asked Larsen to help set up an indirect contact with the PLO. Larsen said yes, and he hosted a meeting in London between an Israeli academic who was a senior lecturer at Haifa University and a guy by the name of Abu Allah, who was Yasser Arafat's economic advisor. And this initial contact led to a series of 12 secret negotiation sessions from January to August of 1993. The meetings were held in various locations in or near Oslo, Norway. That's the reason we call them the Oslo Talks. And the cover story for the first meeting in Norway was that it was an academic seminar. The meetings were hosted by Larsen, his wife, and 2 other members of the Norwegian Foreign Ministry. There were 3 PLO representatives, Abu Allah and 2 others. And the Israelis were represented by 2 academics. The academics did not have any official role as spokespersons for Israel, but nonetheless, the negotiators got off to a fast start. They tried to develop plans for Israel to turn over Gaza to the PLO. The Norwegians provided facilities and were available to helped the negotiation process, but they did not try to impose their own ideas on the substance of the talks. And when the talks were not in session, Larson also promoted the process by acting as a messenger between the Israeli and PLO representatives. Now, a key to the early negotiations was the fact that the PLO delegation included this guy, Abu Ala. Abu Ala had the authority to speak for the PLO, to speak for Chairman Arafat. However, at first, the Israelis didn't know this, and so the first thing they did is they asked Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak, who was able to confirm that Abu Ala could in fact speak for Arafat. The Israelis also tested Abu Ala by asking for concessions from the PLO that were outside the realm of the Oslo talks, and when Abu Ala passed these tests, Israeli optimism increased. Rabin now believed that he was dealing with a valid spokesperson for the PLO. So therefore, Rabin added this guy to the Israeli delegation. His name was Uri Savir, and he was the Director General of the Israeli Foreign Ministry. So this provided a valid Israeli spokesperson, and so that increased the optimism of Arafat and the PLO. The negotiations continued at a faster pace now, but not everything was perfect, as you might expect. At least twice the negotiations threatened to break down, and in each case, the Norwegians intervened and convinced the two sides to continue negotiating. And when the agreement was finally reached, the Israeli cabinet approved it, and then on September 13th, 1993, an official signing ceremony was held at the White House. And here are Rabin and Arafat shaking hands, and that was something that even weeks earlier, nobody in their right mind would have expected to see. Now, the Oslo Accord, the agreement, was a major breakthrough in Israeli-Palestinian relations. It set the stage for the establishment of the Palestinian Self-Government Authority in Gaza and in Jericho, and later it was extended to other West Bank towns. If you take a look at this map on the left, the green, of course, is Israel, and the orange, I guess this is orange, this is Gaza, and the other bigger piece of orange is the West Bank. Those are the Palestinian areas. If we look at the map on the right, the green indicates those areas that came to be controlled by the Palestinian Self-Government Authority. So you can see Gaza is mostly green, but there's a little bit right along the coast that is not. You can see in the West Bank there's lots of green areas, which again indicate that they're under the control of the Palestinians, the Palestinian Self-Government Authority. The white, on the other hand, right here along the coast and in other areas over here in the West Bank, those are areas that continue to be under the control of the Israelis. This agreement also authorized the PLO to establish its own Palestinian police force. The PLO renounced terrorism and recognized the existence of the State of Israel and its right to security. And Israel recognized the PLO as the legitimate representative of the Palestinians. It also committed Israel and the PLO to future negotiations. And as a whole, we can say that it created a period of much improved conditions in the West Bank and Gaza, with relatively good and peaceful relations between Israel and Palestine. Now, the Oslo talks were typical of negotiations with terrorists because they were secret talks. Usually, secret talks are used in a pre-negotiation phase to explore the possibility of more formal, publicized negotiations. So when they're successful, the secret talks produce the preconditions for formal negotiations. And you can see that it was a little bit different in this case. And in that way, the Oslo talks were also atypical because the entire negotiation process was conducted in secret. In this case, the Israeli cabinet and later the whole world was very much surprised when the agreement was announced. Nobody knew what was going on. And the fact that the entire negotiation was secret was partially responsible for the failures of the Oslo Accord, as well as for its success. The failures of the Oslo Accord were caused by the more militant groups on both sides of the conflict who had no input into the negotiations, most notably Israeli settlers and, of course, Hamas. These folks did not feel bound by the agreement. In fact, they actively opposed it. And the result was violence by these hawks on both sides of the conflict. Hamas and other militant Palestinian groups increased their terrorist attacks on Israel. Israeli settlers continued moving into the West Bank. And in 1995, a couple years after the agreement, Israeli Prime Minister Rabin was assassinated at a peace rally. And basically, this is a kind of a grainy picture that shows the assassination as it took place. The assassin was this guy. He was an Israeli citizen. So in the end, the peace process was derailed by extremists on both sides of the issue. And that brings us to a second example of the peace negotiations that I want to talk about tonight. And this is the Northern Ireland peace process. Let's start with a little background. The island of Ireland had been ruled by Britain for hundreds of years, but of course the Irish people had always resented it. And of course in this map you see here's the island of Ireland. In 1922, after a 3-year guerrilla war, the southern 26 counties in Ireland achieved their independence and later became the Republic of Ireland. The Republic of Ireland is in the darker tan color in the map, and its capital, of course, is Dublin. However, Northern Ireland, composed of the 6 northern counties, this lighter colored area, and with its capital of Belfast, though Northern Ireland remained under British rule. And the reasoning for this was that 2/3 of the population of Northern Ireland considered themselves to be British. They were called Unionists, they were mostly Protestants, and they were mostly descended from Scottish settlers. The minority in Northern Ireland who considered themselves Irish were called Nationalists. They were mostly Catholics and descended from the original native Irish people. And as you might expect, Northern Ireland was dominated by the Unionists, the people who were most populous. And that created tensions between the Unionists and the Nationalists. But the real conflict, the troubles, began in 1968. They began after several peaceful nationalist demonstrations were violently disrupted by pro-Unionist police and other Unionists. And this led to fighting between nationalists and Unionists. And the fighting continued, and it got worse. And the British stepped in and sent in troops. And then the British had to step in again and dissolve the local government, which had been unable to deal with the violence. The Irish Republican Army, the IRA, used terrorist violence in support of the nationalists, and several Unionist paramilitary groups began their own terrorist activities in retaliation for the IRA attacks. The British attempted to regain control of the situation by arresting and imprisoning IRA members without trial, which is a policy they called internment. It didn't work. Part of the reason it didn't work is because the British didn't have a very accurate list of who was a member of the IRA and who wasn't. And so they ended up arresting among those that deserved to be arrested. They also arrested a lot of folks who didn't, who were innocent. So that produced a backlash among the nationalist population. It produced new recruits for the IRA and, of course, more IRA violence. Now, another thing that was tried, and Paul mentioned it earlier, as an attempt to keep the peace, was they built the peace wall. The peace wall was approximately 40 miles of walls constructed in Belfast. They're not all contiguous, but they were built to separate Unionist and Nationalist neighborhoods on the idea that if you can keep these folks apart, they can't fight each other. The gates were closed at night, but they had to be opened again in the morning for folks to go to work and to go shopping and that sort of thing, go about their business. Note also that the walls had to be pretty tall, because otherwise they wouldn't do too much good. People could stand on one side and throw rocks, throw bottles, Molotov cocktails over the wall and onto the people on the other side. And you notice that the walls are pretty tall. And actually, they did their job fairly well. It's a limited sort of a way to keep the peace, but for what it was worth, it worked pretty well. But in the meantime, the fighting continued. By late 1980, or the late 1980s, plural, the British government began to question whether the IRA could be defeated militarily. Also, Sinn Féin, which was the political arm of the IRA, was attracting increasing numbers of supporters. And in terms of readiness theory, these concerns increased the British leaders' motivation to end the conflict. The British had also been working closely with the Republic of Ireland to fight IRA terrorism, and the Republic of Ireland had begun pressuring the British to negotiate. Now, on the other hand, Gerry Adams, who was the leader of Sinn Féin, publicly stated that no military solution was possible and that Sinn Féin's goals could only be attained by political means. These statements were a good indication that Sinn Féin was motivated to end the conflict. And also, Sinn Féin began looking for political allies. And they identified three in particular. The Republic of Ireland was one. The Social Democratic and Labour Party, which was the largest nationalist party in Northern Ireland, and they were a non-violent political party, was another. And the third was the Northern Ireland Catholic Church. As a matter of fact, the Catholic priest, Alec Reid, became an important intermediary in secret communications between Sinn Féin leaders and the Irish Prime Minister, and between Sinn Féin leaders and the leader of that large nonviolent nationalist political party I just mentioned, the Social Democratic and Labour Party. And these new allies agreed with Sinn Féin's goals, but they also argued that the solution required the consent of the Unionists. So pressure from their moderate allies was another source of motivation for Sinn Féin and the IRA to negotiate. And then Sinn Féin leader Gerry Adams went to the United States in the mid-1990s. He made 2 trips to the United States to try to add the Irish Americans to the coalition of allies. These trips were quite successful because the Americans wanted a peaceful solution, and Adams was calling for the end of violence, and because the IRA at that time had declared a ceasefire. Now, backing up just a little bit into say 1988, secret back-channel communications had started taking place between Sinn Féin and the British. And over a period of time, each side had made important concessions. The British accepted the idea of Irish self-determination. They made public statements that they had no self-interest in maintaining control over Northern Ireland, and they indicated a willingness to negotiate. Sinn Féin, for its part, accepted the presence of British troops in Northern Ireland for as long as it took, and acknowledged that Unionists must also be consulted about any solution. So by 1997, enough motivation and enough optimism had developed for the two sides to have the readiness for talks to begin. The Northern Ireland peace process can be understood a little bit more easily if we recognize the fact that there are actually a number of different groups on each side with slightly different agendas and so forth. According to central coalition theory, which is just an extension of readiness theory that I talked about earlier, According to Central Coalition theory, all who participate in a negotiation can be thought of as representing a coalition of negotiators, a coalition of folks who are working together to resolve the conflict. All the parties in the coalition, of course, have to have sufficient readiness to negotiate. However, their degree of readiness can differ, and probably will. We can think of a political spectrum ranging from hawks to moderates to doves on one side of the conflict, to doves to moderates to hawks on the other side of the conflict. And doves on either side of the conflict have a higher readiness to negotiate. They're more flexible in the concessions they're willing to make. And they share more values with their counterparts on the other side. But if you look at the hawks, they have a lower readiness to negotiate. They hold more extreme views, and they're less likely to trust those on the other side. And generally, we can say that if the folks who negotiate form a narrow central coalition, that is, a coalition of doves working with doves, what you can get under the right circumstances, you can get a negotiated agreement, but it's pretty likely that that agreement will not be respected or honored by the moderates and especially the hawks. And in fact, that's exactly what happened in the Oslo talks. On the other hand, if we can make that coalition larger or broader and include moderates on both sides and perhaps at least some of the hawks on both sides, so that the coalition would range all the way from here all the way to over here somewhere, then the chances of a successful negotiated settlement, especially one that will be honored by all the relevant folks, is much higher. Now, in 1997, when the negotiations in Northern Ireland began, this is kind of what that political spectrum looked like. The Central Coalition on the Unionist side included Great Britain. Great Britain was mostly a neutral, but they leaned toward the Unionists. One of the two large political parties in Northern Ireland on the Unionist side was the United Unionist Party. They were moderates, believed in nonviolence, and they were very much in the coalition. They're ready to negotiate. And two others over here, these are paramilitary groups. You'd have to call them hawks at one time, but they've become more moderate. This is the Ulster Defense Association and the Ulster Volunteer Force. They are now willing to negotiate, so they're in the Central Coalition. So the only one on the only major player on the Unionist side that was not in the Central Coalition was the other large Unionist political party, and that was the Democratic Unionist Party over here in red. They weren't an armed group, they were just a political party, but they did their best to disrupt the negotiations, to prevent them from happening, and certainly prevent them from being successful. Now, on the nationalist side, the Doves were probably best represented by the Republic of Ireland, which had a stake in all this. The large nationalist political party that I talked about earlier, the Social Democratic and Labor Party, was a moderate, nonviolent political party. And then we have two hawks over here who have become more moderate, Sinn Féin and the IRA, which of course were in the middle of the fray earlier, but they've become more moderate and they're ready to negotiate. There are two smaller groups that were not in the Central Coalition. The real IRA, which is just a small splinter group that broke off of the IRA when the IRA said, let's negotiate, they said, no, we don't want to. And the last group, the most extreme group of all, the Irish National Liberation Army, also was not about to negotiate. So these two groups, armed and dangerous, they were willing to try to use terrorism to break things up, but the IRA turned on them and was, for the most part, able to keep them from acting. The formal negotiations, as I said, began in 1997. A key player in the negotiations was former U.S. Senator George Mitchell. He was the mediator over the entire set of negotiations. At the end, Mitchell set a deadline indicating that all negotiation sessions would close with or without agreement on April 9th, 1998. And the next day, which was Good Friday, an agreement was announced. The Good Friday Agreement called for an end to British rule in Northern Ireland and the establishment of a provincial government in Northern Ireland. It called for police reform. It called for disarmament. Called for the release of paramilitary prisoners, and established a clear level of involvement for the Republic of Ireland in the affairs of Northern Ireland. And in return, the Republic of Ireland formally renounced its claim to Northern Ireland. Now, even if you reach an agreement under the ideal circumstances, the implementation is not always easy. And the implementation of the Good Friday Agreement hit a rough spot in 2002. The IRA had not fully disarmed, and Unionists thought that the IRA had not given up its illegal activities. So the Unionists were on the brink of pulling out of the provincial government. And therefore, the British dissolved the provincial government. They stepped in again and reestablished direct rule of Northern Ireland, at least for the time being. However, most of the terms of the agreement have been honored. The IRA actually completed its disarmament in 2005. Although problems still exist, the Good Friday Agreement has held, the armed conflict has ended, and Northern Ireland is today a peaceful place. These two, of course, were a couple of other key players at the time. This is former British Prime Minister Tony Blair, and this is the Republic of Ireland's Prime Minister at the time, Bernie Ahern. Well, that brings us to the third example of negotiations with terrorists. This is the case of the Basques in Spain. On the Basque side, the terrorist group ETA, ETA, and its political arm, Batasuna, have the goal of an independent Basque state. They want an independent Basque nation. And on the other side, the Spanish government has insisted that the Basque country remain part of Spain. Let me give you just a quick little history here. Before the beginnings of recorded history, the Basques were already there. They were living in the valleys of the Western Pyrenees, this little area right here, which straddles present-day Spain. This is Spain down here, and France up here. For most of recorded history, the Basques remained isolated. They governed themselves. They maintained their own culture, their own language, their own legal system, but eventually the Basque country was absorbed by Spain and France. The final straw for the Basques occurred when the Spanish Civil War ended in 1939, and the dictator Francisco Franco, and there he is giving us a friendly salute, began a systematic Spaniardization of the Basque country. Franco drove the Basque government into exile, outlawed their political parties, repressed, well, actually outlawed the Basque language, and tried to erase the Basque culture and historic national identity. And it was in that atmosphere, in the late 1950s, that ETA was formed, with the goal of defending the Basque language and culture and resisting the dictator Franco. Now, after Franco died in 1975, Juan Carlos became king of Spain. There he is. And he began a process of reform, which led to the establishment of a constitutional monarchy. A new constitution was approved in a referendum in 1978, so Spain is now a democracy. The following year, a limited degree of self-government was granted to the two Basque regions of Spain. The first one is the autonomous community of the Basque country, this composed of these three historic Basque regions. And the second one was the autonomous community of Navarra, which was composed of this larger historic Basque region in Spain. The remaining 3 historic Basque regions are in France, and we're not going to talk so much about them. Meanwhile, ETA accelerated its terrorist activities during the 1970s while Spain made the transition to democracy, and has continued its terrorist activities into the 21st century. Now, you might ask, well, why would they continue their terrorism when Spain turned into a democracy? Well, they didn't want to be part of Spain, democratic or not. They wanted, well, you can see from this mural here, what they wanted was independence. When my wife Chris and I were backpacking through one of the very small villages in the Basque Country, and of course we stick out like a sore thumb. Everybody knows we're not from around here, just looking at us. We saw this mural and we wanted to take a picture of it, but we were a little nervous because we were looking over our shoulders. And so our strategy was, that's me over here. I went and stood by this cute little arch, and Chris took the picture of me in the arch, but really what she was trying to get the picture of was this mural that we thought was so interesting. And of course it has the Basque flag here, it has some other Basque symbols, and if you look up here at the top, this mural was probably painted by, or at least sponsored by, Batasuna, which again, remember, is ETA's political wing. And Batasuna has been outlawed by the Spanish government since 2003. That hasn't stopped them, that hasn't slowed their propaganda machine from promoting independence for all Basque provinces in Spain and France. This one, for example, it says in Basque, the top line is the Basque name for the Basque country when it includes both those areas in Spain as well as those that are in France. It says underneath here, it says, welcome to the Basque country. It says that in English, and then it says it again in French, and then it says it again in Spanish, and then it says it again down here in the Basque language. And I took this a photo of this poster because it's probably the most concise that I've ever seen. And again, it says, tourists remember. Oh, by the way, ignore this. This is just a place where the poster was torn. So it says, tourists remember, you're not in Spain nor in France. You are in the Basque country. And then, of course, it has a happy little welcome. Realize that Spain had its own 9/11. It happened for Spain on 3/11, March 11th, 2004. Al-Qaeda planted bombs in commuter trains during rush hour in Madrid, and they killed hundreds of people. It's by far the biggest act of terrorism Spain has ever seen. And after the train bombings, popular support for the tactics of terrorism by anybody, regardless of whether it's the Basques or whether it's Al-Qaeda, was at an all-time low, not very surprisingly, of course. And second, ETA had been weakened after the arrests of many of its members, actually many of its leaders, by Spanish and French authorities who, since 9/11, had been cooperating much more. They'd been sharing intelligence. And ETA was no closer to a military victory, but its activities were increasingly risky for its members. So they were motivated. And Batasuna was also optimistic, first because in 2004, as a result of the national elections, there was a new Spanish prime minister, a guy by the name of Zapatero, and that's his picture here. And Basque optimism increased again after Zapatero made a statement in May of 2005, which basically was an offer to hold talks with ETA if ETA would end its violence. And of course, unbeknownst to most of us, at the same time, or at least sometime during 2005, secret talks were held in Norway and Switzerland. And they produced a pre-agreement. So ETA and Batasuna were ready for formal negotiations. They were motivated to end the conflict, and they were optimistic based on the fact that we got a new prime minister and we've got some secret negotiations which produced a pre-agreement. They were pretty optimistic that negotiation could work. It could be successful. Now, for the Spanish government, the Madrid train bombings also were a pretty important motivation to end the Basque conflict. The train bombings drew attention to the costs of continued terrorist violence, regardless of who's the perpetrator. So we'd like to end it, and we'd like to end it even more than ever. But despite the successful arrests and prosecutions of ETA members, ETA had always been able to recruit new members. So it was pretty unlikely that the Spanish government would ever be able to totally defeat ETA. Also, Zapatero's government had reason to be optimistic that the negotiation was possible because early in 2004, ETA had announced that it would be willing to talk to the new Zapatero government. They hadn't been talking, of course, to the previous government. And then in November of 2004, Batasuna presented a proposed model for negotiation based on what had happened in Northern Ireland. This guy by the name of Otegi is the leader of Batasuna, and actually he knows what's going on in Northern Ireland. In fact, there he is sharing a podium with Jerry Adams of Sinn Féin during one conference. In any case, the proposal went something like this. Given a ceasefire, ETA and Batasuna would participate in separate negotiations involving different issues. ETA would be limited to negotiations with the Spanish government only on what they called technical issues. Technical issues are things like disarmament, the return of Basque exiles, and particularly important for the Basques was the potential release of Basque prisoners, ETA members who were imprisoned in Spanish jails, Spanish prisons, and they're dispersed throughout Spain. They weren't anywhere near the Basque country, and of course that's a hardship for the families to go visit their loved ones who were terrorist bombers, but they were in jail someplace. And actually you can't tell from this banner, but each of these is a separate photo of a Basque prisoner held in a Spanish jail. You can see there's lots of them. Batasuna, according to the proposal, and all the other political parties in the Basque country would negotiate on all the political issues. And the secret talks in 2005 and the resulting pre-agreement certainly increased the optimism of the Spanish government that a negotiated settlement was possible. And here is Otegi, that's the leader of the Batasuna again, in a demonstration confronting, I guess this is a riot police guy. Now, in March of 2006, ETA tried to get the ball rolling. They announced a permanent ceasefire. Zapatero's response was to move very slowly. He wanted to take time first to verify that ETA was honoring the ceasefire, and then in June he announced that the government would begin talks with ETA during the summer, and then the talks were postponed several times, but finally they began in the fall. And in the meantime, Basques demonstrated in favor of independence. I took this photo of a demonstration in the Basque country. I was particularly taken by the fact that included in this demonstration were the Basque cows, although I had a suspicion that the cows were demonstrating in favor of eating more chicken. Anyway, the problem was that expectations were high, very high, but the progress was very slow. And in late October, ETA members were getting impatient. And they robbed, in late October, ETA robbed a French arms warehouse, taking more than 300 pistols. Things are looking a little shaky. And in December, ETA and Spanish government representatives angrily walked out of a negotiation session. Now it's starting to look ominous. And on December 30th, 2006, ETA bombed a 5-story parking garage at the new terminal of Madrid's Barajas airport, killing 2 people. And the airport bombing effectively ended the peace process. So what went wrong? Well, central coalition theory illustrates a key difficulty. At the start of the process, the government, led by Zapatero and the ruling political party, the Socialist Party, represented the doves and the moderates on the Spanish side of the conflict. But the opposition People's Party, led by this guy, Mariano Rajoy, were definitely the hawks. Now, they were not a terrorist group or anything, but they were a large group of folks, and they were very much against negotiations. And this lack of bipartisan support for the peace negotiation meant that the central coalition was fairly narrow on the Spanish side of the conflict, and the hawks on the Spanish side delayed the negotiations and prevented the Spanish government from taking conciliatory actions that might have kept the hawks on the Basque side from abandoning the peace process. So this is what it looked like in 2006. On the Spanish side, the doves and the moderates are represented by the Spanish government, led by Zapatero, the largest ruling political party, the Socialists, and the hawks, not in the central coalition. That's the People's Party, led by Rajoy. On the Basque side, the doves and moderates were represented by the Basque nationalist political parties, the largest of which was the Basque Nationalist Party, the PNV. But the hawks, represented by Batasuna and ETA, were at least initially in the negotiating coalition. So on the Basque side, the coalition was broader. However, of course, as you've just heard, by the fall of 2006, the hawks who were not securely included in the central coalition on the Basque side, they began to rearm themselves. They were getting impatient, and they threatened renewed violence, and ultimately they carried out the airport bombing in Madrid. So although many conditions favored the attempt to negotiate a settlement, the process failed for a couple of reasons. On the Spanish side, Prime Minister Zapatero did not have sufficient political capital, or maybe you want to call it political will, to move quickly enough to keep the process on track. The opposition by the powerful People's Party effectively tied Zapatero's hands. Now, on the Basque side, Batasuna was not strong enough to keep ETA's hawks in the central coalition. So the Spanish government actually could have strengthened Batasuna's hand by legalizing the party, but they didn't. And Batasuna could have strengthened the Spanish government's position by renouncing violence, but they didn't. So instead, each side played to its own hawks. Well, just to bring you up to date a little bit, just last year, October 2011, there was an international peace conference in the Basque Country in Spain, and it led to the announcement of the end of armed activity by ETA. The peace conference was attended by a pretty large group of notables, including, for example, here is Kofi Annan, the former UN Secretary General. Another one in this picture that you'd recognize, perhaps, is Jerry Adams. He was, of course, the Sinn Féin leader from Northern Ireland. And there were quite a few notables that were not in the picture. All of them signed the declaration. Among those who supported it were former British Prime Minister Tony Blair, former U.S. President Jimmy Carter, and former U.S. Senator George Mitchell, who, of course, you remember as the head mediator in Northern Ireland. So all of this kind of sounds pretty good until you realize that the meeting did not include representatives from either the Spanish or the French governments. But in this atmosphere of possible peace, let me just end this lecture by saying that we have seen that negotiation with terrorist organizations is possible. It doesn't always lead to a successful resolution of the conflict, but when the timing is right and the groundwork is properly laid, negotiation can work. So in closing, let me just say I wish you peace. I thank you very much for coming out tonight, and I especially thank you for listening, and I'll end right here.
Thank you very much for a very interesting and informative lecture. And next, I would like to introduce Dr. Doblin to present a plaque to recognize Dr. Jim Esser's award.
I have a plaque. It reads, "The Faculty Senate of Lamar University honors Dr. James Esser, Professor of Psychology, College of Arts and Sciences, as the 26th Distinguished Faculty Lecturer on November 13th, 2012. Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
And now Dr. Greg Lassen, the Vice President for Finance and Operations, will present the check.
That's actually very easy. I don't have to read the check. Congratulations, we're very proud that
Thank you
you're the
very
first
much.
two-time winner.
Thank you very much. I certainly appreciate it.
And this concludes our lecture tonight. And Dr. Esser will be available shortly after the lecture for any question or discussion. And again, thank you very much for coming to the lecture tonight. Bye-bye.